Mary Lou is well known for her well-known advocate for timely access to prescribed therapies and is frequently sought for her practical and direct approach to complex navigation issues. So please welcome Mary Lou.
Thank you. It's always interesting because as we just left the last session, we saw that top of the list for advocacy interests among patients is access to drugs. But we have only, maybe 10 in the room? So unless you were already keen and did the survey quickly and put that top of mind, I think the reason is because, and I'll go over my disclosures in a sec, I think drug access is an issue that people are concerned about and people hear about and people talk about, but people really have a hard time wrapping their heads around what is the problem, what is the issue, what can I do, what is the concern that I do have. Unless it's right in front of you, it can be hard to think about and hard to understand. So what I try to do in my sessions is break it down. And break it down into tangible pieces that are easy to talk about with colleagues, with patients, with people in a support group, and help people through it so that you know what it is you're working with, what the issue is, and what needs to be done about it. I've been doing this I've been working on drug coverage issues for more than 10 years. In 2005, I was asked to apply for a very unique position at the time, which was called a drug access navigator position. There's many of them now throughout Ontario and other places, and becoming more common in other disease sites, but at the time it was thought of as very innovative. I built the role from the ground up and it was published, so I think what I did right. And I did help lots of people, and I coordinated about $40 million a year in coverage every single year in various treatments for not just people with brain tumors, but people with lung cancer, with leukemia, with all sorts of different cancers. During that time, I got to know the landscape and realized that a lot of other people didn't understand the landscape. There were a lot of patients showing up at my door saying, "Why are you the first person to ever tell me some of this stuff? Why are you the first person that's linked me with a pharmacare program when I've been struggling with drug costs for years?" And I thought, this is not right. And I'll go into a little bit about why that is in Canada, why we don't talk about it. But I thought after 10 years of working directly with patients, I became frustrated by the hamster in the wheel feeling, like the issue wasn't going away, the issue wasn't changing. So with a very supportive partner, I decided to hit the road. And last year, I went out on my own to start a consulting business. So this is what I do now. I go out and I talk about it. I feel very thankful to have the Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada invite me here. They've been an amazing organization that I've worked alongside for many, many years, advocating for temozolomide funding years ago and working with patients. And I have to say, big round of applause virtually for the organizers. It's been a fabulous conference so far. I don't have any disclosures for this particular presentation around this particular topic. I do work with a number of pharmaceutical companies, not directly, I'm not contracted, but I have worked in the past when they've sponsored talks for other groups, or when they've asked me to work on a project to help them understand the landscape and how it's affecting patients. So I want to disclose those today. I also work with a firm at the moment that, again, I contract with. I don't work directly with them. And we're helping to advise pharmaceutical companies about patient support programs, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So, drugs. Drugs are just one form of therapy that people with brain tumors are going to experience. When you're first diagnosed, usually the first thing that you experience is surgery. You may also experience radiotherapy, a number of tests, scans, blood work. Drugs are the one thing that usually hit your experience around treatment. They can be a treatment, or they can be a supportive drug for things like seizure, pain, antibiotics for infection. But drugs are the one thing that around access and how to get them, it's not always clear. When you go in for surgery, nobody sits down and talks about how you're going to get wheeled down the hall, scheduled for surgery, who's going to be paying for it, how that's all going to take place. You might get the ins and outs of what the surgery is about, the risk factors, etc. Just like for a drug, you'll hear about what it's made of, what the risk factors are, the side effects. But nobody talks about access for surgery and radiation and some of those other procedures like they do about drug therapy. And I'm going to get into why that is in this presentation. The main reason is because drug therapy is not a guaranteed medical service in Canada. It essentially comes down to the individual to have to navigate how to get drug therapies and how to pay for them. And the reason I was asked to give the presentation today by the Brain Tumor Foundation is because they hear about this a lot. They hear about the struggles people have with accessing drug therapies. And I'm not talking about new and innovative. They're not saying, and I'm going to talk about this, but they're not saying there's this brand new therapy out and I want to get it, how do I get it? This is about drug therapies that have been approved and listed and put on drug plans, and people are still struggling with how to get them. Standard first-line therapies that are considered standard of care around the world, people are still struggling with. And people are struggling in ways that may not be visible to the general public. They may also be struggling with high costs for things like steroids or anti-seizure drugs. But the way people struggle isn't tracked. We don't ask about it in clinic. Remember that question before about somebody said, why don't we talk about mental health? Why do I have to bring it forward? My experience with drug access is that most people have to bring their issue forward in a clinic setting. And many people working in clinics don't know how to handle those questions or talk about them. So today, this is what I want to do. I want to arm you with some information so that by the time you leave, you're going to be able to identify the key components that affect drug access in Canada. You're going to be able to put your head around it and give it a framework. For those of you already involved in any kind of advocacy and know these issues well, I'll apologize now. This is going to be very basic. If you have specific questions about how it all works or some specific issues, I'm happy to answer them at the end. This is going to be a very basic presentation. You're going to learn not only about why this all happens, but who's out there to help. We don't talk about that a lot because it's kind of all over the place. The roles of who helps and what they're there to do aren't well defined, so you're going to learn that as well. And you're going to be able to leave here with some tools that's going to help you break down a coverage issue when it presents to you, whether it's in a support group or in your clinical practice or through your own experience. You're going to be able to break it down and figure out what are the next steps I have to take to address this. So, any questions before we get started? Anybody in the wrong room? Okay. I was saying, actually, we should have combined the one next door. The presentation next door is all about weeding through information and breaking it down, and this is very much what this is all about today. Because I'm all about the why. Why do things happen? Why do drug coverage issues happen? It seems like lately, now maybe because I'm a little bit biased and I'm on Twitter and I follow things around drug coverage, it seems like it's everywhere. But people also tell me this. They say, I'm hearing about national pharmacare and I don't understand why people keep pushing for national pharmacare. Or drug prices, I hear it's crazy. Why are drug prices so high? It's probably the number one question I get. Why are drug prices so high? There's campaigns like the No Time to Wait campaign that's going on right now with metastatic breast cancer patients. That's all over Twitter, where people are saying, we want drugs now. We don't want to wait for them. And then you hear individual patient stories in the news. You know, the patient out in whatever province who wants this treatment and her drug plan won't cover it, and she's fighting it and she's appealing it and everybody's up in arms and she's going to her MLA. So what I wanted to do today was try to break this down a little bit in what causes some of these things to happen, because it's confusing. And the main reason is this. We have no national drug access strategy in Canada. And you've probably heard that before. People say, we have no plan. No, I'm not talking about a plan. I'm not talking about national pharmacare. I'm saying that in Canada, we have never sat down and said, what is our strategy to make sure people get the drug treatments they need? For instance, you hear about wait times. When have you heard about a wait time for a drug therapy? What's the minimum amount of time someone should wait for treatment when they have a stage 3 glioblastoma? We don't talk about that. And with drug therapy, one person could wait 3 days in one province to start that drug. In another province, somebody could wait 10 weeks. We have no standards on how a drug should be accessed, who should dispense it, where it should be dispensed from, who should pay for it, how much of that cost should be covered. We have never been able to, as a country, come together and agree on any of this. It gets debated and debated and debated. So we recently had legislation, a bill put forward in the House just last week, if anybody was following that. Not that I necessarily support one bill over the other. I just want everybody to get on with it. But this bill was about, okay, feds, we need a national pharmacare. This was about national pharmacare, and it says we need to have it within a year. And you know what everybody said in the House? There's so much we got to go over. No, we got to get together on pricing. We got to deal with the pricing issue before we can ever do that. So we don't want to put it out in a year. We need more time. Do you know how long we've been debating about a national strategy of any kind around drugs? 30 years. No joke. It was actually supposed to be part of Medicare, national drug access, and it didn't get put in, and each successive government keeps saying, yeah, we got to get to that. And nobody ever does. Because it's so complex now, we don't even know where to start. So at the end of the day, though, because everybody's fooling around and trying to figure out what's going on, and some people are saying, it's the pricing issue we got to get to, and other people are saying, no, it's pharmacare we got to get to, it's basic access. No, and others are saying, no, our strategies for bringing in new medicines is too slow, we need that to be faster. Because everybody's on a different page, including patient groups, patient organizations. When everybody says, we want drug access to be #1 priority, patient groups often don't know how to interpret that. So they start focusing on a particular issue that maybe the board is familiar with, or the patients have talked about, or maybe that a lobbyist, not for this organization, but others, have said, you know, you should really think about this. This is really what the problem is. Everybody gets on a different page, pushing a different issue, and that means nothing gets done. And the issues among patient groups and the messaging is very conflicted. So at the end of the day, that means it's still on the individual. It's the individual's responsibility to pay for drugs in Canada. Well, so some people say, but my drugs are paid for. Why is that? And that's because if you are in hospital and your drugs are provided to you while you're an inpatient, that's simply because our Medicare system covers anything you get in hospital while you're in hospital. And some people say, well, I wasn't in hospital, but the province paid for it. That's because some provinces have stepped up to the plate to develop specific programs around drug coverage, but every province is different in what they've decided to do. It's all over the place. At the end of the day, unless your province has stepped up or unless you're admitted to a hospital, it's on your dime to figure out. It's not only for you to pay for, through your insurance, through your own pocket, whatever, it's your responsibility to figure it out. So, in figuring it out, what is this all about? What are some of the key issues at play for drug coverage? First one, approval. In Canada, for a drug to be accessed, Health Canada needs to review it to show that it's safe and it's effective and it's not going to kill you the minute you take it. There's a number of steps that Health Canada goes through their Therapeutic Product Directorate to approve that. And it's actually on the drug company that's made the drug or the manufacturer to submit to Health Canada their data to say, please cover this. If a manufacturer has no interest in putting that drug in Canada, Health Canada is not obligated to go look for it and go approve it. So the onus is on the drug company to bring it forward. The next one's pricing. Do you like the little bounce? That's to keep you awake. Pricing happens simultaneously with the Health Canada review, and that goes through something called the PMPRB, or the Patented Medicines Pricing and Review Board. Don't worry, for those of you familiar with it, you'll know that's been in the news a lot too, because it's gotten a lot of criticisms to say the way we look at drug pricing in this country is way out of date. It's linked with patent legislation and overseeing patents and trying to encourage development and manufacturers to make their drugs here, and it's not working. The way pricing works in Canada is, sorry, I keep stepping in front of you. When manufacturers bring their drug forward, they give an estimated price. But separately to that, the PMPRB goes and looks at what's going on with this drug? Are there other drugs already on the market? What are they priced at? Are there other drugs in the same therapy area? What are they priced at? So they start looking at the other ones that are out there, and then they go and they say, has this drug already been approved in other countries, which are called the comparator countries? And there's a list of certain comparator countries that they use. And out of those comparator countries, essentially, the PMPRB looks at how they've been priced, and they take an average. And they say, okay, from that average, we agree it meets what it needs to do, this drug. There's other things that are comparable out there, and this is their price range. And this is the average price they've made in the other countries. So we've decided on a maximum price that you can set. And if the manufacturer's price that they've provided is over that, PMPRB comes back and says, no, you got to lower it. And then negotiations ensue. But usually the prices are under that. So that's how the price is set. The price is really just set at, you can't charge more than this if you want to sell it in Canada. So we have Health Canada that's given approval, and they say, you can sell it, go ahead, it's safe, nobody's going to die from taking it immediately. And then the PMPRB says, okay, you can sell it, but don't charge more than this to hospitals or drug plans or whoever's going to eventually buy it. So technically, after those first two things are done, anybody could buy it. Anybody could walk in off the street to a pharmacy and purchase the drug. But think about the price of drugs that are coming out now. For many treatments, it's not unusual for a drug to cost $3,000, $10,000. The highest I ever had for a drug was $17,000 per treatment. So who has $17,000 in their pocket? I'm going to say, here, I'd like to buy this. Not too many. So the next step is that all the things we rely on to help pay for our drugs, which is either insurance or a public drug program, the provinces, they have to evaluate that drug. And they rely on something called CADITH, which I won't go into today for lack of time. But CADITH, through the Common Drug Review, or there's one for oncology as well, called PCODER, they look at the drug and they don't just look at, is it safe to take? They say, does this drug give us bang for the buck? Is what they're asking for a price, that maximum price, does that justify everything they're saying it does? Whether it extends life by 4 months, whether it improves certain symptoms, whether it cures disease, is this worth it? It's not to say you can't buy it. CADITH is just providing an evaluation and a recommendation about its worth or its value. And CADITH is an area where you can contribute because patient groups are often asked for submission on new drugs, and the Brain Tumor Foundation is aware of how all this happens, so you can look to them if you want to get involved. And they say, patient groups tell us, this new drug that's coming out, how is it valuable to you? And patient groups often come forward in their submissions with things that CADITH hasn't even considered for how it's valuable. So that patient group input is important in the evaluation. So that's through CADITH and PCODER. So then CADITH and PCODER come out and they say, yes, you should pay for this, and the price is worth it. Or they say, drug company, lower your price a bit more, and then the plan should pay for it. At that point, those who are going to pay for the drug for you, whether it's the province or a hospital or a drug plan, then has to look at, can we pay for it? Can we afford it? Is it worth it to us? So there's a whole round of negotiations that go through on the pricing or on the payment of it and how it should be paid for. And that goes through two different mechanisms. Insurers have their own, and then the provinces for their drug plans all come together, and they have their own mechanism called PCPA. So what does that mean for patients? So this is the first thing I want you to consider, because a lot of people talk about it takes too long to get drugs in Canada. It takes too long for new drugs to be approved. Well, here's why. First of all, we're small. On the worldwide market, we represent 2% for most diseases of the worldwide market for drug use. We're not at the top of the list for priority. Most companies go to the FDA in the States first, or the European Union. So one of the things you're going to see is you'll often see through patient chats or talking at a support group, somebody will talk about a new drug that the FDA just approved. Woohoo! That doesn't mean squat here. Just because the FDA approves it doesn't mean it's available in Canada, and most likely it's going to take another 180 days for that company to come forward and submit it to Health Canada. Some companies do it alongside their submissions to FDA, but usually FDA approves it way ahead. So you've got that wait. Then it's going to take Health Canada and PMPRB 442 days to review their data that's been submitted and decide what they're going to do to approve it and what they're going to price it at. And then, for those who are lucky enough to have $17,000 in their pocket or whatever the cost may be, you could then purchase it. But if you're relying on a plan to pay for your drug, it's going to take them another 180 to 450 days to then review the data and decide. CADITH will then make a recommendation, or a drug plan will make a recommendation and say, yeah, well, this should be approved. And then that's when everybody gets really excited. They say, Health Canada's approved it, CADITH's recommended it, wonderful. I'll have drug companies coming to me saying, I don't know what the issues are because everything's been recommended, everything's been approved. But it then takes can take 200 days for a province to decide if they have the money to pay for it, or a drug plan to decide if they're going to pay for it. So the evaluation and the payment can take a long period of time. So from a time a drug leaves clinical trial to the time it's actually available for payment through a plan for you to get is about 3 years. So the issue around access to drugs, that big priority people have, if it's about access to new therapies, that's legitimate. It does take a long time. How do you change that? A lot of it has to do with patient input through the patient group and advocacy at the policy level in terms of improving some of those long times. Once something gets approved, let's say we're all done with that now. And once something gets approved, though, then what happens? Well, the majority of people rely on either insurance or a public plan. I don't know if anybody's in the room with no coverage at all. I'll put my hand up because here I talk about this and I don't have any at the moment because I've gone out on my own. So most people rely on one or the other. And what a lot of people don't really get is that we have a lot of plans in Canada. We have over 1,000 plans. We have 102 provincial plans alone. Each province runs several programs for different populations, different groups of people, plus we have some federal plans as well. Guess what that means? It means things are all over the place. So a drug might have been approved, priced, evaluated, and recommended. But remember we got to that last part, payment? And if a plan has decided that, oh, sorry, I went back. If a plan has decided that they can't afford it, or they don't agree with the recommendations and they're not going to fund it, that means somebody with one type of plan is going to be able to get the drug and somebody else isn't. That's where we get back to that lack of standards. It's all over the place. What people also don't realize is that the people that drive the plans, even though you're ultimately responsible for payment and many people rely on these plans, you don't really have a lot of say in how they work. If you're on an insurance plan that's paid for by your employer, it's that employer that drives how it works. So that's why unions often get involved on the plans and they talk about what they want. But it's really the employer, based on their affordability, based on their priorities, who decide what goes on a plan and what it looks like. And similarly with public plans, it's the government. It's not the people running the program, it's the people that pay for it. So like I said, we have different payments and plans right across the country. And they do a lot of work. In 2014, in Canada, let me look at my notes, $29.4 billion was spent on prescription drug therapies. That is many treatments, not just supportive drugs. That is many treatments for many different illnesses, cancer and non-malignant tumors included. People often say, well, I don't know what everybody's going on about access, because we've got insurance plans out there and we've got all these public plans and they're covering stuff. So why do we keep talking about access and people having problems? It's true that 68% of people in Canada have an insurance plan and 29% have access to a provincial plan or a federal plan or some sort of public plan. So if you do the math, 68 plus 29, who's paying attention? Shout out. 97%. So that means 97% of people have a plan, so 3% of people, that's probably the rich folks, they don't need one. So why is everybody struggling? Well, you can't look at who has a plan to go on looking at need. I'm the social worker, so I'm always saying, nah, that doesn't make sense. Let's look at the need. And when you drill it down to who's paying out, that's where you get a better picture. Even though 68% of Canadians have insurance, insurers actually only paid out 35% of that $29 billion in drug costs. And insurers will go on about how much they pay. And they do. And it's becoming harder to afford drugs. I get that. But really, at the end of the day, it's only 35%. Public programs do take on the bulk of it, 42%. But neither of those figures means those guys are paying the whole kit and caboodle. Individuals still take on 22% of prescription drug costs. So that's both the 3% without a drug plan, but the majority, it's because their plans don't cover enough of the cost. And they're still paying out a significant amount out of pocket. So people are struggling, and often the struggle is invisible. One of the things we do not do well in Canada at all is ask about drug costs. We think because we have universal health care, not realizing we don't have any of those standards on drug therapy, that everybody's okay. We're not taught about it in medical school. We're not taught about it in pharmacy school, so I'm trying to change that. And I do lecture to pharmacy students who say, nobody's telling us this stuff. I didn't realize it was like this. Nobody's teaching social workers. Nobody's teaching nurses. So do we have a form that everybody has to do when they come into clinic that asks them about drug coverage? Some hospitals, yes, because they've taken it upon themselves, but the majority do not. There's actually studies being done now about things called financial toxicity, which is a big thing they talk about in the States, but about financial need, and there's some interesting research coming out of Calgary that talks about the fact that we don't talk about financial impact of disease and how it affects people. We put the onus on the patient to bring it forward, and we do that with drug coverage. So oftentimes people don't bring things forward because it's not talked about. They don't think that's the form to do it. But where else are you going to do it? If you can't get a therapy and you're cutting back on your therapy to ensure you can afford it, are you going to be the first to tell your doctor about that? Probably not. So I have seen everything in my time. I have seen pain meds being stretched out. I have seen people taking the acute or short-term version, short-acting version of a pain med versus a long-acting because of cost, and trying to make do. I have watched people ration their insulin. I have seen people not take their antibiotics, and it's not because they don't believe in taking the full course of antibiotics, because they can't afford them. I've watched kids go without puffers, and my most favorite case was the guy that sat in front of me and talked to me about how he would put his insulin needles in boiling water to sterilize them so he could reuse them. And of course, he'd been hospitalized for infection. I've also seen 2 cases of people re-hospitalized for cardiac arrest because they couldn't afford their meds on discharge, and they didn't know who to go to tell them. And that was leftover cost from their plan. That wasn't the full cost. So where do you go for help? The bottom line in Canada is let me get to this part first. I already talked about this patient input piece. If your concern is around more or less about the access and the affordability, and it's more about getting drugs to patients earlier, these are some of the ways you can contribute. And I did have a video to talk about that, but for interest of time, we're not going to play it today. But the Brain Tumor Foundation of Canada is aware of input submissions and how they work. So if you're ever interested in that piece, by all means, inquire about it. They're always looking for input.
I just wanted to say that as somebody in the marketing department and somebody who sits on the advocacy committee as well, we are actively looking for these submissions to CADIT and PCODA, anything that's relevant to the brain tumor in the community. And the second it is, we have a survey that's almost ready to go so that we can get it out to everybody and get people's feedback. So if you ever see us looking for a survey for CADIT, PCODA, please tell everybody that we need this survey completed as quickly as possible, because we need to get people's feedback. And watching this presentation, you understand the urgency that's now behind it as well.
I'll just add to that just recently sitting in on a CADITH meeting, CADITH is now looking at the numbers that respond from the different patient groups, because it's hard to mobilize patients and get them realizing like how important this is. And CADITH is starting to they want patient input, but they're starting to look at different ways that could be done, because there's also groups that are going to market, or consultants, professional consultants, who will do up these submissions for them, and they're not truly getting patient feedback. What CADITH wants is they want the patients and health providers' input about why these drugs bring value, why should we bring them into the country, and why should we put them on plans. So it's important. But let's get back to the affordability. So again, let's say it's on plans and people are having trouble getting them. The problem is in Canada, there's no standards for drug access. And because of that, there's no standards for training for who actually works with patients on drug access issues. We have drug access navigators in the country. We have some nurses, some pharmacists, some doctors helping patients as best they can, but there is nowhere to go for training. That's what I do now. But we have no standards, we have no institute, we have no licensing body. So everybody's just doing it differently. So one of the things that's developed to help people is something called patient support programs. This has been developed by the pharmaceutical companies, and I have a pamphlet on this to hand out so people can better understand it. Patient support programs are not integrated into your healthcare clinic. They are a separate program that pharmaceutical companies develop, usually with a new product or a complex product. And the idea is to help steer you through some of these issues. Their goals are reached. They help you navigate through your drug plan so that they can get coverage sooner and get you started on the drug therapy sooner. But in the end, they also help you because they take the stress off of some of those questions as well. They also provide financial assistance for some drugs so that you may be able to get some copay assistance as well if the costs are high. I'm going through these a little fast just because of time interests. The other people that can help are the case managers if you have an insurance plan. Many of the insurers now are hiring case managers or case management firms who can help you through the process of figuring out your drug coverage. Again, they're employed by the insurer, so they're going to work to the benefit of the insurer, not always your benefit as well. And they're often, they may refer you to some additional programs, but usually they'll help you within the confines of the plan itself. So again, it's kind of limited. So we've got the patient support programs that help you from their end of things, and then we've got the insurers that help you from their end of things. If you're on a public plan or have no plan, or if you're working with some of these other things as well, there's always the health team. And there's a number of people on the health team who may have knowledge about drug coverage, but again, their training is going to vary. In oncology centers in Ontario, there usually is a drug access navigator. Other than that, it's a bit all over the place. They exist in Atlantic Canada and out west as well, but it depends on the center. Pharmacists can be helpful as well, and pharmacy techs, in helping you figure out paperwork and if you're struggling. But again, the issue is you often have to bring it forward yourself. And then there's patient organizations like Brain Tumor Foundation, who are usually your best source of information. So let's say your plan gets cut off. They are one of the people that you can go to say, my plan was cut off, what does the province offer? And they can go through in your province what's offered to you. So really, if you think about it, there's some different support out there. Patient support programs, which are drug specific. There's case management through your insurer. There's the healthcare team. And there's patient organizations. But there's a problem with that landscape. They're all working differently. They're all within their own confines, and they're all working from their viewpoint of what's available or what they can do, and nobody's working together. One of the big goals I had with this consultancy was try to get everybody working together. Because we really do work in silos around this issue, and it can make things very confusing. So I'm going to go to the last piece. They told me I could go over time just a little bit, just FYI, you're not going to miss lunch. The last piece is about, okay, all these people are on different pages. You might have a patient support program helping you for a drug, or you might have your insurance, or you might have somebody else. But really, it comes down to you. In Canada, the onus is put on the individual to navigate it. So how can you do this on your own, and how can you understand what's going on your own, rather than feeling at the mercy for what all these people are telling you? So here's some of the common challenges that people have. We talked about already when a drug's not available yet in Canada and you just want to get that drug. That's about giving input through some of the input submissions that were mentioned. And I'm going to talk a little bit about other ways you can do that. Another one is the drug is available, but it's just not on your plan. So it's out there in Canada, but you're waiting and waiting and waiting because you can't afford to pay for it. You want your plan to pay for it, but they haven't listed it yet. And you can be months waiting between the time a drug is actually available for sale and the time your plan actually says, we'll help you with the cost. One of the number one things I hear about is the paperwork. More and more and more, all these insurers and public plans that are paying for drugs are facing high costs. So what have they done? They've said, you need to prove that this thing works and is doing well for this patient, and that it's the right drug for this patient before we're going to pay for it. So the doctor often needs to submit paperwork. Has anybody ever dealt with paperwork for something like that? Yeah. So special authorization paperwork or prior authorization is now standard of practice for most expensive medications and many others, and that's because of mainly for watching costs. Then there's high out-of-pocket payments. Plans are shrinking. We all saw the Sears thing going on. I don't know if anybody saw the news with the lady who's 100 years old who was cut off from a group insurance, and that was a good plan for Sears years ago. That was a really good plan that they had. So yeah, it can anything. I've watched people go through mass layoffs from plants where gone tomorrow, their insurance. I've watched people whose plans change because the employer can't afford it anymore, and they were paying only $10 a prescription one day. The next day, it's a percentage. And now that percentage has jumped and they're paying hundreds. So high out-of-pocket costs is a reality. Limited coverage. It's not unusual to see a patient all of a sudden realize they had a plan maximum and their plan only covers so much of the cost. I once had a patient, still near and dear to my heart, who was advocating for better coverage, and he had melanoma. He needed a drug that cost $14,000 a month. And he and his wife, he was 33 at the time, 2 little kids, sitting in clinic with the doctor. I talk about this because he made his plight public and was on the radio about it. He gets the diagnosis, is in the hospital, in the clinic for 3 hours, hearing about his diagnosis, which he did not realize was metastatic till he got there. Then heard about the treatment, got counseled on the side effects, had a 4-hour drive home that night, and only for the doctor to end the clinic visit with, so this is $14,000. Do you have insurance? And he and his wife start frantically looking for their drug card and saying, yeah, I think we do. She comes down to my office, I'm still in practice at the time, and says, there's this guy in the clinic, he's having a really hard day, explains the situation to me, says, I think he could use your help. He comes running down behind her saying, I found the card, like it was going to save everything. I looked at the card and I thought, I figured out from where he worked it was probably going to be limited insurance. I said, let's make the call together to the insurer. We made the call together, and he had $5,000 worth of insurance, and he didn't know. Now, long story short is I linked him with a public plan, and it all worked out 10 days later. But as he later said on the radio, I had gone through everything that day. I heard about my disease being metastatic. I heard about my life expectancy. I thought about my kids. And I held it all together, and it was the moment she told me I only had $5,000 worth of insurance and I thought I couldn't get this drug that I broke down, and that's when he did. He broke down right in front of me. And he said later on the radio that he didn't sleep a wink those 10 days, despite every day I called him and I said, don't worry, it'll work out. You're not going to pay for anything in the end. It'll work out. I have a patient assistance program. I have public care. It's okay. But he didn't sleep a wink until that actually happened. And that's a reality for many people with limited coverage. And then there's, of course, if your plan says, no, you can't have that drug, you have to take this one. That's another thing that people go through. So again, it's on the individual to figure this out. This picture I use is one of my favorites because I saw that look so many times. I call it my say what picture. What? What do you mean? And when I give this presentation to pharmacists, this is their favorite one too, because they say that's what they face at the counter when they have to deliver bad news to the patient. So this is how you navigate it. It's really going back to what you learned in grade school. The what, why, who, how, and when of what's going on. And I have a handout for you today that essentially does that. It breaks it down into those questions. So let's go through a couple scenarios, and I'm going to wrap up. I'm not going to go through every single scenario that I just talked about, but I'm just going to give you an idea of how to approach it each time. So let's go through. Somebody comes to you in a support group, let's say, and they say, this brand new drug's out, but it's not available in Canada. It's so freaking frustrating. I want to get it. How do I get it? So you know from attending my session that it can take up to 3 years for a drug to be available to people on their plans. But who's the one to help? Now, you're not always going to know who's going to help, but that's what my handout's for. In this case, it's the health team, it's the doctor that prescribes it, who needs to take some responsibility to realize this might not be available out there. Just because Health Canada is reviewing it doesn't mean it's available. So what's the first thing to look at? Maybe a clinical trial might still be going on in Canada. And to link with that, if not, there's something called the Special Access Program. Anybody ever hear of that? Hands? Okay. I'm preaching to the choir here. So with Special Access Program, that's a mechanism that can be used if the drug company says, you know what, it's not available in Canada yet, but we'll release it to you, or we'll release it to you for a fee. Special Access is the body within Health Canada that says, yeah, you can do that. So there's two things the doctor has to go through. It's approaching the drug company to see if the drug's available, and then they have to go through Special Access and actually get approval for that drug company to release it. So that's one. It's just the why, who, and how. Another scenario. So the drug's been available. Health Canada did their approval. It's available for purchase, but it's not yet available to be, or it's not yet evaluated. Or it's not yet on your plan. And there could be a number of different reasons for that. One is it's not yet been evaluated by CADIT. They haven't made their recommendation. Another was that the drug was evaluated, but the plan didn't agree to cover it. Cost, didn't agree with the findings. Or it could be the plan said, yeah, Blue Cross, Green Shield, whoever said, yeah, we're going to cover it, but not your plan. Because we can have all of you in the room, you could all be under one insurer, you could all have different plans. It depends on your employer and what they can afford. So the thing to find out is the why. How does it affect you? I don't know how many patients came to me on referral because the doctor sent them away, said, go check your plan, and they came back and said, it's not covered. And I said, well, what do you mean it's not covered? How is it not covered? So then we'd have to go through these questions. Most of the time it wasn't yet evaluated. And if it's not yet evaluated, what you do is going to be a little different than if it's not on your plan at all. If it's not on your plan at all, you often have to either appeal or look at other options. If it's not yet evaluated, you have to wait. One of the things that happens in Canada, because we don't have any standards and we don't have any training for people to ask the questions, and we don't have point people on every team to be able to answer your questions about drug coverage, is we have a lot of anxiety out there. And I have watched people get extremely anxious about things that are actually quite routine in the world of drug coverage. And one of them is around these types of questions. There's another one, and this is the one that causes the most anxiety, the delay in the paperwork. Oh my God, they might not cover it. Yeah, that's true, but chances are they're going to. Prior authorization paperwork is a process. Usually your doctor is prescribing something to you because it does fit guidelines. There's a reason for it. And usually those guidelines are the same ones that your insurer or your plan agrees on. They just want to make sure. So the doctor has to fill out the paperwork. But there's often delays. Delays in Ontario on the public drug programs are because of the way the public drug programs are run. They're very process heavy, and they do take a long time. I often get I have a call from a colleague in Ontario who said, you know, this paperwork's going to take an awful long time. It's going to be with weeks. I said, well, here it'd be overnight in Nova Scotia, where I'm from. It depends on the plan. So delays can have to do with how the plan works. It could be most likely that the physician didn't fill everything out right, which is the number one reason. Or it could be just because things are dragging on because the insurer has some questions. So who you go to is going to vary depending on what the issue is that's going on, but usually your insurers or your plan is the first step, and then the health team, and perhaps a patient support program if you're linked with one. Again, that's in the handout. So I just threw this in at the last minute. This is from a news article about when we talk about the anxiety. This was from a young woman who was waiting on paperwork, and it was a whole article about drug access. Well, actually what the article was about anxiety. And it was about, this lady was quoted in saying it took 2 weeks. Well, 2 weeks is pretty standard actually for a special authorization, but nobody told her that. So they just said, well, let's hope it gets covered. We'll put in the paperwork. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe they just said, we'll put in the paperwork, and that's what she thought. But she said, I was sitting at home and freaking out. Never in a million years did I think I'd be facing thousands of dollars in medical costs that might not be covered. But in the end it was, because it was covered on her plan. So a lot of what I give you is to try to bring down some of the anxiety that's out there. The final scenario I'll go through is high out-of-pocket costs. And this is where you have to ask a big why. Oftentimes it has to do with the plan the person has, but it might be different by drug, or it might be different by situation, or sometimes people have different levels of coverage for different things. The first place to go again is your plan, to ask why. And the second is the health team, to see if there's any help for it. And it could be a patient support program. If it's an expensive drug and you have a high out-of-pocket costs on the leftovers, let's say you have a drug that costs $10,000 per month, and you have a 20% copay on your plan. Who's paying attention? How much? $2,000, right? And you say, I don't have $2,000. Make your health team aware of it. Patient support programs that I talked about earlier as one form of assistance are out there for different expensive drugs, but your doctor has to refer you to them most of the time. There's a few exceptions that I talk about in my handout. But the doctor has to refer you, and if your doctor doesn't believe in patient support programs or doesn't like to work with them, and there are many that don't, you're not going to get referred and you're not going to be told about it. And guess what? You're going to have to figure out that $2,000 on your own. So if you cannot afford something, or you have a high pocket out of cost, or if someone you're working with in a support group or your workplace does, look into whether a patient support program exists. Go back and talk to the doctor. Tell them about what's going on. So this again goes to the researchers in Calgary, David Campbell and his team, who have looked at the diabetes population and the cardiovascular population. And they found that when people brought their concerns back to the health team, whether it be about high out-of-pocket costs or lack of coverage or changes in their coverage, how the health team handled it then was a strong predictor for whether how that patient dealt with their issue. So let's say if they say, okay, I get it. Yeah, there's a patient support program. We're going to link you with that. Is there anything else you want to talk to me about? Is there any other ways costs are affecting you? And they start talking about that. That's going to be different than somebody says, well, you should have figured that out. You should have better insurance. I can't help you. How do you think that patient's going to react on the next visit for the next issue that comes up if it's handled in the second way? So what David Campbell and his team said is that they acknowledge that things out there to help, there's nothing out there to help with financial costs. We don't talk about it. There's no standards. So it's really up to the individual health providers. So if you came here today looking for an exact formulary to help you figure out drug costs, it's not going to happen, but I do have handouts, and that's because it is so complex. So what I tried to do today was break down why the issues happen and how you can start to approach them to start to understand them. I do hope the handouts I have here help a little bit more with that. They're more specific than what I gave you. This was to give you a taste of it. And then these will give you some more practical tools to be able to work with patients or work with your own situation should one come up.